Hi, good evening. Thanks very much. It is really absolutely wonderful to be here. I want to thank you, Eileen, first of all, for that amazing introduction. It's the kind of thing that you wish your parents could be there to hear, you know, because your mom or your dad would like it, but your mom would actually believe it, right? So it is wonderful for me to be standing actually here tonight on this stage for any number of reasons. My love for Abraham Lincoln goes back to early childhood. And I have had just the most marvelous time since arriving here yesterday. Everyone at the museum, everyone at the library, you do not know in this community how fortunate you are to have these people who are able to take a collection of documents and artifacts, to take buildings, bring them to life, and give them the reverence that they deserve, and give this place the reverence they deserve. But also to make it a place that is welcoming, that is friendly, and so inspiring to anybody who walks through these doors. And I felt that way yesterday when I came in here for the first time and saw the film on the eyes of Abraham Lincoln. How many of you have seen that film, by the way? Okay, very good. And I made a deal with the guy backstage. If I start bombing out here tonight, he's just going to start the Battle of Antietam behind me, and I can run off in a cloud of smoke and make my retreat. But anyhow, I really cannot thank all of you enough for wanting to come out tonight and to talk about a couple of women who obviously mean so very much to me, Margaret Fuller and Louisa May Alcott. Bear with me for just a minute or two. Yeah, my dual subjects, Margaret Fuller and Louisa May Alcott, you see there in front of you. They had a great deal to bind them together. To begin with, both of them had very strong ties to the Transcendental philosophical movement that dominated New England thought in the decades before the Civil War. Margaret Fuller edited The Dial, which was the avant-garde Transcendental magazine that she founded along with Ralph Waldo Emerson. She was a frequent visitor to Brook Farm, which was the Transcendental utopian commune in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. And she also worked for a time assisting Bronson Alcott, who was Louisa May Alcott's father, at his experimental Temple School, which was undoubtedly the era's boldest experiment in transcendental learning. And if the word transcendental is mysterious to you, it's something we can certainly pick up with in the Q&A. It was a mystery even in its time. The Transcendentalists at one point decided that they would form a transcendental club until they realized that everyone had a different definition. Okay? And Emerson at one point was talking with someone, just kind of randomly, and mentioned the word transcendental. Do you know what I just said? He said, yeah, I think it has to do with teeth. Because, dental. So anyway, but we can get into the various definitions of that. Fuller was a restless thinker, and her transcendental period actually only lasted about 5 years. But nevertheless, she now tends to be thought of, if she is thought of at all, as a disciple of Ralph Waldo Emerson's. Now, Louisa May Alcott, for her part, could hardly have escaped transcendental influences even if she had tried, and she probably wanted to. She was, after all, Bronson Alcott's daughter. Bronson was a very quixotic man, and his plans for reform affected her powerfully. She suffered alongside him and the rest of the Alcott family throughout the short life of their experimental community at Fruitlands, and then for long decades endured the privations that inevitably awaited the children of a penniless philosopher. Louisa May Alcott, of course, lived in Concord, Massachusetts, alongside Emerson, Thoreau, and the defiantly non-transcendental Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Fuller stayed in Concord often enough to be a sort of unofficial resident. And she and Louisa both enjoyed the splendors of Emerson's library. Both of them took boat rides with Henry David Thoreau on Walden Pond. And of course, both of them were among the most visible advocates of women's rights that their times brought forth. And yet, for all of these shared links and acquaintances, Margaret Fuller and Louisa May Alcott barely knew each other, and time and circumstance saw to that. An age difference of more than 22 years divided them. The much older Fuller found little reason to observe or comment on Louisa, and indeed, no reference to Bronson Alcott's tomboyish second eldest girl appears in any of Margaret Fuller's writings. Also, before Louisa turned 12, Margaret Fuller was out of New England. She had departed to pursue a journalistic career that led her first to New York City and then to Europe. And also, as I believe you heard in Dr. Makovich, her introductory remarks, in 1850, a freak hurricane destroyed the ship that Fuller had been sailing on home to America, drowning not only Fuller, but also her Italian husband and her 22-month-old son. And at that time, Louisa was only 18. So, not surprisingly, the list of remembered anecdotes in which both of the women figure is decidedly brief. I'm actually aware of only two, but I'm going to share both of them with you. The first one concerns a day sometime in the early to mid-1840s, no one's exactly sure, when Emerson and Fuller had decided to pay a visit to the Alcotts at their home in Concord. And Bronson and his wife Abba were standing at the door, talking with their illustrious guest, and they were discussing the current state of education. Now, Bronson had been a teacher. He had left the teaching profession under a cloud, and he was bemoaning the fact that he currently did not have any school in which to try out any of his new ideas in childhood education. But Fuller reminded him, well, Mr. Alcott, you've been able to carry out your methods in your own family, and I would like to see your model children. Well, a moment later, she got her wish, because around the corner of the house came a wheelbarrow that had been transformed by youthful imagination into an ancient chariot. And in the contraption was the youngest Alcott daughter, May, in the costume of a queen. Louisa had been bitted and harnessed to the royal car, and she was a horse, being driven by her sister Anna, while the last and third oldest of the daughters, Lizzie, went alongside on all fours, barking like a dog. Okay? And so they were all, in Louisa's words, shouting and wild with fun. They careen around the corner of the house, and there they see the Norton Anthology of American Literature. Right? You've got Emerson and Fuller and Alcott, and they trip all over themselves, and they just fall over in a laughing heap. And Mrs. Alcott apparently had dealt with things like this before. She did not miss a beat. She grandly gestured to her daughters and said, "Here are the model children, Miss Fuller." So that's the first of the two anecdotes. The other one is briefer. It's not as funny, but it might actually be more instructive in a way. 2 years before her death, Louisa May Alcott wrote a letter to a young fan in which she reflected on the state of a world that required women, if they were to have any life of the mind at all, to balance that life with all manner of housework. Now, Alcott, it has to be said, had grown accustomed to, and she actually enjoyed, simmering stories in her mind as she simmered dinners on the stove. And she wrote to her young fan to praise, not to complain about, the practice of multitasking, 19th century style. She wrote to her young correspondent, "I'm glad you've discovered how much that is lovely as well as useful that the word housekeeper means. The mere providing of beds, meals, etc. is a very small part of the work. The homemaking, the comfort, the sympathy, the grace, and the atmosphere that a true woman can provide is the noble part and embraces all that's helpful for soul as well as body." Alcott then fondly recalled how a friend of her mother's, a very brilliant but little remembered woman named Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley, quote, "used to rock her baby's cradle, shell peas, or sew, and fit a class of young men for college at the same time. One can discuss Greek poetry and chop meat, as I saw her doing once with Mr. Emerson and Margaret Fuller, and the one task ennobled the other because it was duty." Now, the image of poor Mrs. Ripley parsing Pindaric odes while getting the dinner ready will probably not strike too many of us as a progressive image of feminist empowerment. Nevertheless, it's an important one if we're to lay aside the tempting but misleading notion that our 19th century literary heroes were just sort of 21st century progressives who fell into a time warp. Okay? We need to understand them also in the way that they understood themselves. And as I think the writings of both Fuller and Alcott illustrate, the very concept of women's equality meant something different to them than what it does to us. Now, we know that beginning in the 1950s, carrying on into the 60s and beyond, more than a century after Fuller's death, about 70, 80 years after the passing of Louisa May Alcott, American society experienced what might well be regarded as an explosion in the field of civil rights and personal privileges, an explosion which continues to affect and influence our lives today. Now, I would argue that the change in our perception of rights has been not only quantitative, we got more rights, but we also think differently about them quantitatively. Not only did America as a society begin to believe that individuals possessed more rights than they were previously understood to have, but a shift also occurred in the thinking about how those rights ought to figure in the daily life of a citizen. Now, we need to understand that equality, as Dr. Makovich was telling us, matters, and it matters vitally. The idea that we're all entitled to be considered and rewarded on the extent of our talents, the earnestness of our efforts, and in Dr. King's immortal phrase, the content of our character, is, I think, the only rational basis for a civil society. And yet, there can be side effects. It seemed to me that with the legal emphasis on legal rights, has come also a widely held assumption that those rights are best employed for the somewhat selfish aggrandizement of the individual, sometimes at the expense of the welfare of society as a whole. Very often we tend to think and act as if this result were inevitable. Why would individual freedoms exist if not for the material benefit of the single person? But what I find fascinating about the way that Margaret Fuller and Louisa May Alcott both thought about women's rights was that they did not presume that the best and highest use of a freedom had to be the material enrichment and gratification of the self. They both tacitly assumed and overtly argued that women ought to have greater power and freedom in society in order that they might benefit not only themselves, but also one another and men as well. Fuller and Alcott freely blasphemed against the more modern gospel of self-centeredness. Now, this is not to say that Fuller and Alcott were blind to the more practical economic necessities that caused women to cry out for civil rights. As I'm about to show, both authors were painfully aware of the financial misery to which unequal laws exposed the women of their time. I'll argue, however, that both Fuller and Alcott saw deeper principles in women's rights than could be measured in terms of political power and economic opportunity. For them, what was most fundamentally at stake in the fight for women's equality was a host of intangible talents, or intangible values, rather, including a sense of dignity and usefulness, and the chance to develop all of one's talents, whether the world classified those skills as masculine or feminine. Alcott consistently argued that one should use one's liberties to strengthen and to enrich the larger community. And Fuller valued above all the power to create oneself as a spirit and a soul. Now, on the subject of women's rights, both Fuller and Alcott were strongly influenced by their fathers. Fuller recollected that her father, Timothy, who was a four-term congressman from Massachusetts, was, quote, a man who cherished no sentimental reverence for woman, but a firm belief in the equality of the sexes. From the time I could speak, he addressed me not as a plaything, but as a living mind. As a result, Fuller regarded herself from the beginnings of her conscious life as a child of the spirit. And she grew up confronting adversity with what she termed, quote, an outward serenity and an inward peace, unquote. As for Alcott, her father pledged in his teaching to help secure, quote, the emancipation of the female mind, unquote, from what he called, quote, the tyrant man, unquote. When Louisa was 5, Bronson lamented in his journal the failure of men to, quote, acknowledge the rights of woman, unquote, and to recognize her place as a co-worker in realizing the mighty destinies of humankind. Bronson believed fervently in the greatness and sanctity of his daughters' souls, and, like Timothy Fuller, he considered the education of his children as a uniquely sacred task. So much so that from the time they were infants, Bronson Alcott compiled journals that chronicled their every intellectual and moral development. These are amazing books. They still exist in their original form in the Houghton Library at Harvard University. They've never been published, and it's really a terrible shame, because you can go there and find out the day that Louisa's sister first recognized the color red. They're that detailed, and they're all about the early growth and the mental coming of age, at an early age, of a girl who just happens to go on to be one of the most significant writers of the 19th century. And so it's a personal campaign of mine to try to get these published. It hasn't happened yet, but we'll see. Bronson was very firm on the subject of women's rights. He wrote in 1866, whatever women can do, let them be free to do. They have shown themselves equal to every position that they have chosen to fill. And yet for all the encouragement that Timothy Fuller and Bronson Alcott gave their remarkable daughters, some of the most enduring lessons that they taught them regarding the importance of a woman's independence derived from an unhappier source. Neither man was a great financial planner, and both Margaret and Louisa learned what it was like to live in a country whose laws gave women almost no protection against the poor economic judgment of their husbands and fathers. As I've already mentioned, I think Fuller's father died when she was 25. I think I mentioned that. Anyway, he left no will, and much of his estate was tied up in unprofitable investments. And in keeping with the prevailing practice of his time, he shared none of his financial decision-making with his wife. And so not only did Fuller's mother suddenly find herself without income, and not only did she find herself with no knowledge of how to manage the family's economy, but she was also hamstrung by the laws of inheritance then existing that enabled her to inherit only a portion of her husband's wealth free and clear. So she would have been thwarted even if she'd had the requisite experience. So Fuller knew her subject well when she complained in her essay, The Great Lawsuit. If a husband dies without making a will, the wife, instead of taking at once his place as head of the family, inherits only a part of his fortune, often brought him by herself, as if she were a child, or ward only, not an equal partner. Now, Fuller's father's death meant that she had to forego a long hoped-for trip to Europe that she thought was essential to her intellectual development, and she was also forced to embark on a career in teaching, chewing up months and years that she could have more profitably devoted to study and to writing. So her legal inability to control her family's finances cramped and distorted the contours of her career. In Louisa's case, the economic inequality between the sexes was felt not because her father died too young, but arguably because he lived too long. In matters other than the financial, Bronson was a benefit to his daughter's career. It was through him that she met Thoreau and Hawthorne and Emerson. He built with his own hands the desk at which she wrote Little Women, and it was Bronson's negotiations with Roberts Brothers, her eventual publisher, that led to the writing of Little Women. It probably would not have been written without him. But as an economist, Bronson was a walking disaster. What money he got his hands on frequently went to his somewhat crack-brained ideas for reform. Just as often, there was no money to begin with. Bronson would sometimes go on speaking tours to try to bring back money for the family. There's a famous story of the time that he comes back from one of these tours to announce not only did he earn only $1, but his overcoat was stolen. So he ended up worse than he'd started, but Abba was very understanding. He said, well, I call that very good indeed, and you'll do better next time. But that was the experience that Louisa grew up with. Her mother's family underwrote a series of Bronson bailouts, always doing the delicate legal toe dance to assure themselves that the money would be under Abba's control and not Bronson's. And Louisa spent a lot of her childhood eating bread and apples. Her sensitivity to financial want became so acute that from the age of 18, she noted in her diary at the end of every year, every dollar that she had made, down absolutely to the last dollar. There's another Alcott scholar whom I'm very fond of, both as a writer and as a human being. His name's Joel Meyerson. And he told me once that he thought Louisa had acquired a sort of Great Depression mentality from having been so deprived as a child. Because in her traumatized judgment as an adult, no amount of money for Louisa was ever enough. Even after Little Women had brought her more wealth than she could ever have imagined, Alcott continued to churn out poetry and novels and short fiction at an astounding pace, always hoping to make just a little bit more money in security. And that killing pace that she set herself to actually, I believe, shortened her life, and she did pass away just at the age of 55. And her father, whom she continued to support in his old age, died just 2 days before she did. Alcott herself never married, perhaps in part because she feared losing control over her life and fortunes in the same way that her mother had. So then, economic freedom for women undeniably mattered greatly, both to Fuller and to Alcott. They would have agreed that it was supremely difficult, though perhaps not impossible, for a woman to look to the higher aspects of her destiny until her financial security and independence were well established. Yet they would also have agreed that worldly comfort was not the all-consuming goal of a well-ordered life, whether male or female. Economic stability was merely the precondition for a better cultivation of the mind and for a life not of greater self-indulgence, but of heightened sharing and enlightened self-sacrifice. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about Fuller and then a little bit of time on Louisa. The first thing to understand about Fuller the thinker is that she believed completely in spiritual progress. The idea that she was destined to rise ever higher as a mind and a spirit held for her all of the qualities of a religious faith. Her philosophy of nature was deeply informed by the work of a German philosopher. His name was Friedrich Schilling. He was an associate of Goethe's, and he thought that all of physical nature was in a process of spiritual evolution from the rocks on up. Okay? Everything, all of creation, was moving gradually in a struggling fashion, but constantly, toward a greater consciousness of itself and toward an ever more ideal form. As a child of this seemingly upward universe, Fuller took it as her personal duty to aspire and always to improve. And she gave her idea of this ascension in a statement of beliefs that she hastily composed one evening when she was about 32 years old, but she never published it. It began this way. There is a spirit, uncontainable and uncontained. Within it all manifestation is contained, whether of good, accomplishment, or evil, obstruction. To itself, its depths are unknown. By living, it seeks to know itself, thus evolving plants, animals, men, suns, stars, angels. And it is to be presumed an infinity of forms not yet visible. Because nature was so aspirational, Fuller averred, humankind remained in harmony with nature only when it too sought forever to improve and spiritualize itself. But she was quick to realize that all of the individual efforts you could make to turn yourself into a better person were not going to go anywhere, nowhere important anyway, as long as society insisted on imposing limitations on people's lives, especially limits related to gender. She bristled at the common assumption that the infinite soul could only work through women in already ascertained limits. These were her words. That the prerogative of reason, man's highest portion, is allotted to them in a much lower degree. If Fuller demanded political and economic rights for women, and she certainly did, the material gains were only secondary. What she wanted was for women to participate in the marketplace, but the reason that she wanted them to was because she thought that they could reform the marketplace, that they could reform the tendencies that men had developed toward greed and exploitation. And this is what she wrote to the women of America. You see the men, how they are willing to sell shamelessly the happiness of countless generations of fellow creatures, the honor of their country, and their immortal souls for a money market and political power. Do you not feel within you that which can reprove them, which can check, which can convince them? Tell these men you will not accept the glittering baubles, spacious dwellings, and plentiful service they mean to offer you through these means. Fuller saw that a person's best self was not his or her money-making self. And that was a lesson that she thought that women were poised to teach to the country. Now, her first great work on women's rights was an essay that she wrote for the Dial. She called it The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Men, Woman versus Women. And then later, she revised it while she was vacationing on the banks of the Hudson into a book-length document called Woman in the 19th Century. But the earlier title is interesting, The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Men, Woman versus Women. You would expect in a women's rights treatise that sets it up as a lawsuit that the men would be on one side, the women would be on the other. No, it's man versus men, woman versus women. Now you need to understand what that means. When Fuller talked about man singular or woman singular, she was talking about the ideal spirit of both gender, right? Both genders. The human being raised to the highest level of awareness, intellect, and soul. But then when she used the plural, men, women, she was referring to the way that most of us let ourselves turn into, right? Where we are beaten down, where we are dwarfs of ourselves. We're not as big as we can be. We're those sulking creatures, that sort of drudge from day to day and don't have an awareness of the divinity, the beauty, the love that is really, truly inside us. Okay? That's what men means. That's what women means for Fuller, plural. Fuller argued that human beings in the modern world had lost their God-given inheritance of nobility, wisdom, and truth. Why had they lost it? Because both genders had accepted identities that made them inferior to what they might otherwise be. Women, she believed, had been forced into a resentful dependency by men who regarded them either as mere sexual bodies or, almost as bad, as a collection of material appetites that the men were then obliged to satisfy. Under the prevailing arrangement, neither gender was happy, and neither was free in the most important sense of freedom, the liberty to cultivate one's talents and to make oneself into a being that would be pleasing both to society and also eventually to God. In Woman in the 19th Century, Fuller wrote, "I have urged on woman independence of man, not that I do not think the sexes mutually needed by one another," because they did, "but because in woman dependency has led to an excessive devotion which has cooled love, degraded marriage, and prevented either sex from being what it should be to itself or to the other." Fuller summarized what she took to be the real objective of the women's movement that she was helping to found as follows. She said, "What woman needs is not as a woman to act or rule, but as a nature to grow, as an intellect to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded, to unfold such powers as were given to her when we left our common home." And what, one might ask, would happen if the nature and powers of the individual woman, allowed to develop freely, didn't conform to the world's ideas of what was properly womanly? Well, Fuller didn't see that as a problem at all, because she had been to the houses of friends, and she had seen little girls who had picked up and started playing with the miniature carpenter's tools that had been bought for their brothers. And she had seen the cheerfulness that the girls reflected when that kind of play was encouraged. She'd also seen what happened when the girls were told, no, 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 that's not proper for a girl. They became sullen, they became mischievous, they became unhappy. Masculinity and femininity, she assured the readers of the Dial, were, quote, perpetually passing into one another. Fluid hardens into solid, solid rushes into fluid. There is no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman. Now, this is something that she realized when she was a kid, because her father, as I've tried to explain, put a lot of educational resources into her because he saw that she was brilliant. She had brothers. The brothers were not up to the same intellectual level, and apparently they were all just cute as bug's ears. Okay, and you go to the letters that Mrs. Fuller wrote about her children. They're all about how smart Margaret is and how cute the boys are. So there was really a reversal of what you would have expected. And so Fuller and her brothers grew up with this much more fluid notion of what a boy or a girl was supposed to be. And when they became older in 19th century America, they were in for a real shock because of the prevailing expectations. But anyway, Fuller wasn't buying that. And probably the most famous line in Woman in the 19th Century comes when she's talking about what should be the scope, possibly, of a woman's career, and she declared, "Let them be sea captains, if you will." So take that one home with you anyway. Fuller regarded her position as a fundamentally patriotic one. She asked freedom for women so that her entire nation might be truly free. She complained, "The free American often feels himself free, like the Roman, only to pamper his appetites and his indolence through the misery of his fellow beings. You're free, but you use that freedom just to exploit." It was a debased, unlovely liberty. Nevertheless, she hastened to add that the words of Thomas Jefferson, "All men are created equal," had not been spoken in vain. They still stood, she insisted, as a golden certainty, with a power to encourage the good and to shame the bad. While any person remained base or degraded, she argued, no one could be entirely noble or free. Okay? And so almost 20 years before President Lincoln proclaimed a new birth of freedom on the fields of Gettysburg, Margaret Fuller imagined a somewhat slightly different one, but still a very significant one, at her writing desk near the Hudson River. Now, for Louisa May Alcott. For Louisa, as well as for Fuller, equal legal and economic rights for women were only part of a much larger, more complex vision of social reform. Unlike Fuller, who came to see the necessity of sweeping social change rather late in her life, Louisa May Alcott grew up with the assumption that society needed to be fixed and that the changes had to touch all corners of the Republic. Here's an example. Well into her 30s, Margaret Fuller was skeptical of abolitionism. She was an enemy of slavery. She thought slavery was morally wrong. But the abolitionists bugged her because she found that they could manage to be both tedious and rabid at the same time. Ironically, it was only after she spent time in Italy that Fuller appreciated the freedom movement that was going on in her own country. Now, by contrast, Louisa May Alcott was described by her mother as being an abolitionist from the age of 3. And the reason that it happened when she was 3, she was playing one day on the Boston Common, and she fell into the pond, and whoever was looking after her didn't see her. And she couldn't swim, she was 3, she was starting to go under. A hand reached down and pulled her out. It was the hand of an African-American man, a free citizen of Boston, whom she had never met, but he saved her life. And so from that moment on, she was very much in the wagon as far as the rights of African-Americans were concerned. She tended eagerly to the runaway slaves who passed through her parents' home on the Underground Railroad, and she considered it the greatest of honors to serve tea to the widow of John Brown. During her childhood, another critic, Sarah Elbert, has observed, Louisa knew scarcely anyone who was not a general in the armies of reform. Now, women's rights in particular mattered a lot to the Alcott family. Bronson referred to women's suffrage as the reform of reforms. Abba insisted on the extension to women of all civil rights as an essential ingredient in the welfare and progress of the state. And also, certainly, we don't have proof of this, but I cannot imagine that Louisa grew up without having read Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century, which became a standard text of women's rights. And Alcott, very early in her fictional career, proclaims, "I'm a woman's rights woman." Hers, though, was a concept of women's rights whose consistent touchstones were usefulness and charity. Something to remember about these two wonderful women who are up before us is they were both New Englanders, and they both had a very strong, broad streak of Yankee practicality. And what offended Louisa more than anything about this assumption that women were best suited to be wives and ornaments was the incredible waste of energy, the loss of talent that such a belief entailed. To the pragmatic Miss Alcott, opening the doors of opportunity to women did not seem like a radical idea, it was common sense. And you combine that sensibility with a powerful impulse to charity. Remember that Little Women begins with the March family, who don't have a lot on their own. They go off and they share their Christmas dinner with the Hummels, who are worse off than they are. Okay? Charity was a touchstone of her life. And that's also a huge part of what women's rights meant to Louisa. I'm going to share with you just a couple of scenes from one of what I think are one of her best books, An Old-Fashioned Girl. In one of them, the heroine, who's named Polly Milton, escorts her fashionable but bored and disaffected friend, Fanny Shaw, to visit a small improvised colony of poor but talented, independent women. Polly herself teaches music. Another one is an engraver. Another one still is a sculptor working on a sculpture of an idealized new woman. Now, Fanny is a veteran of constant and countless mind-numbing luncheons with the more popular empty-headed girls. And when she sees these women who are actually doing something, she feels like she's walked into a new world. Quote, "They seemed a different race of creatures from the girls whose lives were spent in dress, gossip, pleasure, or ennui. They were girls still, full of spirits, fun, and youth, but below the lightheartedness, each cherished a purpose, which seemed to ennoble her womanhood, to give her a certain power, a sustaining satisfaction, a daily stimulus. It was a tableau, in short, of self-realization that Fuller would have been proud of." Now, in the other scene, Polly goes to her mentor, a woman named Miss Mills. She's got a problem because she wants to ask some of her other friends, who are the sort of wealthier, more superficial group, to help another poor girl get started in her own business. And Polly's afraid that if she speaks her mind, this smarter set is going to reject her and that they will mock her, both for being old-fashioned and for being, quote, "a rampant woman's rights reformer," unquote. What could be worse? Miss Mills replies, "This love and thought and care for those weaker, poorer, or worse than ourselves, which we call Christian charity, is a very old fashion, my dear. It began 1,800 years ago, and only those who honestly follow the beautiful example set us then learn how to get genuine happiness out of life. I'm not a rampant women's rights reformer, but I think that women can do a great deal for each other if they will only stop fearing what people will think and take a hearty interest in whatever is going to fit their sisters and themselves to deserve and enjoy the rights God gave them. I want every girl and woman to feel this duty and to make any little sacrifice of time or feeling that may be asked of them. Okay. Now, the word sacrifice, which I just read, is very key, because it's the concept of sacrifice that was interwoven into almost all of Alcott's important fiction. Her parents valued nothing more than the surrender of self for a worthy cause, and it is the stamp of an Alcott heroine that she works to make of herself the best person she can be, so that when the time comes for her to give of herself, the gift is as great as it can be. Now, the principle of sacrifice seems odd. It seems like a strange thing to base feminism on. At the end of Little Women, you may recall, Jo March gives up her writing career so that she can marry Professor Bear. And then not only that, but she decides to help him found a school that's going to be exclusively for boys. Very odd end for that novel, because that novel is so much about the empowerment of girls, and it really seems like Jo is kind of, she's giving up in the end, that everything that she's learned about female growth and emancipation was somehow in vain. But there are a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, specifically, Little Women is only the first book of a trilogy. You've also got Little Men, you've got Jo's Boys. And those other two books you need to read as well, because they restore a great deal of the feminist energy that seems depleted at the end of Little Women. In Jo's Boys, Jo's literary career has been resurrected, her ship comes in, and she has settled into a life of, quote, money, fame, and plenty of the work that she loves, unquote. And Plumfield is no longer just a boys' school. It's added a coeducational college in which both young men and women train for the professions, and the girls anticipate Billie Jean King by whomping the boys on the tennis courts. The school thus becomes, at last, a shrine of gender equality rather than its graveyard. But there's a larger point, and that is, although you see feminine sacrifice all the way through Alcott's fiction, you also discover that she is demanding male reform as well. Half a dozen of the male students at Lawrence College are pronounced true men only when they come out for the woman's right to vote. One of Alcott's female characters in Jo's Boys observes on the subject of boys, "Let them prove what they can do and be before they ask anything of us, and then give us a chance to do the same." So if Alcott heroines have to conquer vanity and shyness and temper, Alcott heroes have a way to go too. They have to learn temperance, they have to learn humility, they have to learn self-mastery. And interestingly enough, those things that Alcott calls on you to sacrifice are things that you are always better off without anyway. You get rid of the egotism that assumes the superiority of one sex or color over another. You get rid of your slavish attachment to fashion or to material goods, okay? And the belief that material excess is the key to happiness. Just drop that stuff. You don't need it anyway. You'll be better without it. If that's a sacrifice, yeah, we should all do it. In the late 1870s, shortly after the death of Louisa's mother, the Massachusetts legislature approved for the first time the right of women to vote. But they were very careful about it. They were just going to have women vote in school board elections because women know about kids and education. So that's safe. You know, not governor, that's a little scary, but they can vote for school boards. Now, Mrs. Alcott, Louisa's mother, had dreamed all her life of casting a ballot. She died just shortly before this was enacted. But Louisa made sure that she was going to be the first woman in line to register to vote in the town of Concord. So on the day that it becomes legal, she goes down to the town hall and presents herself to be enrolled. And the assessor says, all right, well, that's fine, but you have to show me your tax receipt from the past year. Louisa didn't know that she had to have a tax receipt. Oh no, what do I do? Thinking quickly, she said, oh, but will you accept the receipt from this year? And the assessor said, well, yes, I suppose, but the problem is we haven't had taxes yet for this year. You haven't paid them. And she said, well, I was never in a hurry to pay taxes before, but now I'm in a real hurry to pay them now. So they brought out, she wrote a check, they brought out a receipt, signed her up, but there was still one more barrier before she could vote, because the selectmen of Concord were fair and they were pleasant, but they were also thorough, and they solemnly requested that she submit to the required literacy test. And so, Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women and much else besides, read a few lines aloud from the Constitution to prove that she could read, and signed her name to prove that she could write. And with that, she became the first woman ever entitled to vote in the history of Concord, Massachusetts. Small beginnings. And it was 40 more years that would pass before a woman's right to vote became part of our Constitution. And it's a sad truth that neither Margaret Fuller nor Louisa May Alcott lived to witness more than the tiniest fraction of the bold, brave reforms that they imagined. Today, it would appear that the larger frame of their vision that I've been insisting on, that both men and women would use their rights for the improvement of their souls and talents, and would exercise their freedoms for the betterment of others, still remains too often unfulfilled. We've come, I think, to view the struggle for equality as sometimes a zero-sum game, in which a gain by one group of persons means a corresponding loss for another. Fuller and Alcott would have been puzzled by that logic. They would have argued that an increase in freedom for some was a blessing for all. But they would also have expected from those who demanded equality to perpetually ask themselves, how can I use the freedoms that I am fighting for to help create a happier life for those around me? Okay? Louisa and Margaret both would have understood that the best use of power is not the ability to command service by others, but the enlightened opportunity to give service. They would, I think, and by the way, on the subject of service, I can't see out into the crowd, so I won't ask for a show of hands. But if any of you have been to Louisa May Alcott's grave at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, you will find that there is only one indication of anything that she did in her life, and it's a very modest bronze-colored star indicating that she was an Army veteran because she was a nurse in the Civil War. That was what mattered. Okay, and I also think that Fuller and Alcott would have observed another limitation in a philosophy that focuses too exclusively on equality under law and assumes that law is all the work that needs to be done. Because to really work, I'm convinced that equality has to be more than a legislative agenda. It's got to be part of the way that we treat one another every day, down to our smallest interactions. That waitress who served you coffee this morning was not a machine for pouring coffee. That person who stood in front of you when you were trying to get across the street today was not just an obstacle to keep you from crossing the street. That was a person. Another hero of the 19th century, Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, wrote a novel you may have heard of, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Its alternate title was The Man Who Was a Thing. Stowe was writing, we should understand, not just against slavery, but also against the tendency to thingify, our persistent tendency to think of our fellow human beings, sometimes anyway, as less than human. Now, thanks to Stowe and to Fuller and to Alcott, and above all to Abraham Lincoln, we no longer legally buy and sell our fellow men and women. But so long as we regard our fellows as objects and instrumentalities in any fashion, so long as we deny one another the dignity of true equality, the work of Stowe and Lincoln and Fuller and Alcott will remain unfinished. I thank you.